Everyone. Oh, okay. Thank you for telling us. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Institute for Australian and Chinese Arts and Culture at Western Sydney University. My name is Jing Han. I'm the director of this institute. The music you just heard is especially curated by our research fellow and musician, Dr. Nicholas An. As always, I would like to first of all acknowledge that our institute is on Parramatta South Campus, which is on the country of the Darug people of the Darug Nation, and acknowledge their ancestors who have been the traditional owners of their country for thousands of years. We also want to acknowledge and pay our respect to the First Nations elders of their countries we are sitting on today, past, present, and emerging. Coincidentally, or not so coincidentally, today's lecture, which is the last lecture of the 2021 series, features the early link between the First Nations people and Chinese migrants. A research on Chinese Australian families in Northwest Queensland. A union under very unique historical and legislative circumstances, with a range of legislations in the name of protecting, but rather restricting, controlling, and discriminating against the Aboriginal people. Relationships with the Chinese men who were also a target of discriminations have formed an important part in Australian colonial history. So today we're very pleased and privileged to have Dr. Hilda McLean to give us this very interesting presentation. Dr. McLean is a genealogist, historian, and archival researcher. She received her PhD in archaeology from University of Queensland. During her time at the Queensland University's Cultural and Heritage Unit, she undertook historical and genealogical research centered on the Berkshire and was a contributor to the Gulf Country 2019 by Dr. Richard Martin. As usual, at the end of the lecture, we will have a Q&A session. You can post your questions in the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen, and I will collect them for Hilda to respond. Now, please welcome Dr. Hilda McLean to give her talk.
Thank you very much. How is my sound?
Sounds good.
Okay, right. Well, thank you very much for welcoming me into your homes this afternoon. I'm now going to share my screen and hopefully this will work this time. Okay.
Yep, looks perfect, fine.
Thank you so much. Right. I also wish to acknowledge the traditional guardians on the lands and waterways in which we meet today. I'm speaking to you today from Yugambeh country in southeast Queensland. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, please note that this presentation contains images of and names of deceased people. And the big important note for this afternoon is this presentation also contains material of a highly derogative nature. It contains terms and languages that reflects the ideas and views of the authors of the document or what was in common usage in the period of the time which the item was written, and definitely will not be considered appropriate today. So on occasions, I will be required to use the G word without the word tonic attached to it. So that gives you an indication of the strength of the language, which will be highlighted in these documents this afternoon. But I decided not to redact the language because for people who are beginning their journeys on archival research, they need to be aware when they open that folder at the archives, this is the language that will be confronting them. So I'm sure you've heard plenty this year already about living under the Act. Now, for our non-Queensland viewers, this is the protection and restriction of the sale of Opium Act 1897 for Queensland, which amongst its various functions created reserves for the purpose of isolating Aboriginal people from contact and intermixing with other races, predominantly the Chinese, South Sea Islanders, and people who were considered to be low-class whites. Now, this act ostensibly provided protection for Aborigines against exploitation, especially in the pearling and beach demure industries. And Chinese employers were particularly targeted across a range of horticultural industries as well. I'm not going to go into a long and detailed explanation of the Act and how it impacted on the lives of Indigenous people in Queensland. I would like to refer everybody who is interested in this topic to perhaps read Dr. Sandy Robb's excellent thesis, North Queensland Chinese Family Landscape from 2019, where she has a very clear and concise explanation on the impact of the Act on the lives of both Chinese and Indigenous couples. However, what I will say, if it wasn't for the Act, we may not have the copious quantity of archival resources left to us today that was generated by the implementation of the Act. Now, the Act was assented to on the 15th of December, 1897. Almost immediately, there was a spike in Chinese and Indigenous marriages. It was almost like the local protector of Aborigines, who was also the local police sergeant in many cases, was going around telling couples they needed to get married while they still had the opportunity to do so. So there were at least 5 marriages celebrated in the Burke Registration District in 1898 alone, and a couple more in 1899. So I've just put in this sequence of marriages from 1898, and searching through the block number of marriage registrations one by one, I was able to find some more. For example, a marriage between an Aboriginal woman and an Afghan man, a marriage between the Javanese man and an Aboriginal woman, and 4 marriages between European men and Aboriginal women. Many of these couples were already known to have had children at the time of the formalization of their relationships. And this is perhaps one of the reasons why the couples were encouraged to become married in order to legitimize the children of the relationship, as so termed by Walter E. Roth, who was to become the the Northern Protector of Aborigines. However, even Walter Roth's patience was being frayed when he put out that no marriage of a female Aboriginal with any other than Aboriginal should be celebrated without the authority of the Home Secretary. Yet legal marriages continue to take place with Europeans, coloured aliens, etc. He was quite exasperated, and he was making a list of all the couples that were being married in his annual reports for the Northern Protector of Aborigines, which is a very rich source of information. And the 1897 Act was amended in 1901 and assented to in 1902, that the permission of the Chief Protector of Aborigines had to be sought in order for a marriage to be formed between an Aborigine and a non-Aboriginal person. So a non-Aboriginal person had to apply in writing, addressed to the Chief Protector. This was often communicated through the local police station, and then the letters were forwarded on to the Chief Protector. Mm-hmm. Now, also, what the Chief Protector was most concerned about was the number of children which were being born to Chinese men by either Aboriginal women or mixed race Aboriginal women, under which he still had control. So a little snippet in the Northern Minor from 1901 caught my attention, and it indicated to me that there were quite a few more children that had been born to these couples than previously able to be found through the Registrar of Births, Deaths and Marriages. So, for example, we had a census in 1901, and although the data has not been kept, the statistical information had been retained. And they found that there was between Chinese men and white women, there were 635 children, and between Chinese women, between Chinese men and Aboriginal women, there were 91 children. Much of this, of course, was due to the absolute dearth of Chinese women in North Queensland at the time. And again, I refer you back to Sandy Robb's thesis for a discussion on this. So the census data is much more likely to be accurate because many couples did not register their children at all, or they weren't registered until many years after their actual births. And I'll give you an example of this further along. So after 1900, there was still a steady number of couples who were being married, having applied to the local protector of Aborigines, and then having their marriages approved. And in many cases, they were, in fact, that there were children already part of the relationship, and so there was the marriage was performed to legitimize these children. Now, not all of the marriages we have been able to find correspondence files between the local protector Aborigines and the chief protector. It's a case that maybe they have not survived, or it was an interpretation by the local protector as to how Aboriginal the woman was. Because in many cases, we have Chinese men marrying mixed race Chinese Aboriginal children, particularly once you get into the next decade. And the further on you get, the fewer correspondence files we are actually finding. Also, by looking at the correspondence files, and these are held at the Queensland State Archives, we're finding that gradually it is becoming more difficult for Chinese men to marry Aboriginal women who are not of some Chinese blood themselves. And by the time you get to about 1917, 1918, permission is being routinely denied. So for couples where the permission were denied or was not sought, this is by far not a complete list. I know that there are many of you out there, families. But this is just an example of some of the well-known couples who we have not got marriage certificates for. So it can be assumed that if they had approached the local protector and the application did not proceed, or they did not go forth and approach the protector at all. But I would like to show you a case that is fairly typical of what happens when a Chinese man wishes to marry an Aboriginal woman. And in this case, the permission was refused. Now, this is the section where the language is extremely derogatory and the documents have been transcribed word for word. So we have this tiny little document from the marriages file correspondence file from 1912. And I have transcribed it as written. It seems sometimes we cannot be sure if the letter is being written in the hand of the applicant or by a scribe who is writing as dictated to by the applicant. In this case, we have Tommy Lee Foy, who wishes to marry Ruby, and he has already fathered a child with Ruby. Now, Tommy also points out that in the past, he has been married to another Aboriginal woman. And therefore, it's like he's saying, well, you've given me permission once. Why may I not have permission again? The writing on the side, the red note on the side is a request from, do you have any information of the subject? Okay, please let me know. Because not only were in the protector side of being the local protector Aborigines, if they were going to approve a match, they had to make sure that it would be one that was of benefit to the woman. Now, Tommy signs off his letter, and I know from other documents from Tommy, he can actually sign his name in English, but I have not managed to find a signature for him in Chinese. So this could be his writing, the writing in the signature that matches the text. So I'm fairly confident that Tommy Lee Foy is to a degree literate. So that's his initial approach. This is the reply, for the cover letter forwarding, going up to the Chief Protector of Aboriginals. And this is from Percy Gilchrist, who's the local protector. He's also the local sergeant. I have copied the writing exactly as his is written by him. He has some very idiosyncratic spelling, total lack of punctuation, irregular uses of capital letters. But on what does he think about the parties? I know this China. I think there should have been a full stop there, because he goes on to say China man all the way through. And I don't think much of him. So now you've got the tenor of the local protector. Okay. However, he knows Ruby, and he knows there is a child in the relationship. And he is a little concerned that the father of the child wishes to look after or raise the child. Excuse me. But the local protector interviewed Ruby, and she told him distinctly that she did not wish to marry Tommy. And Ruby has now found herself a new partner. Okay, so Gilchrist told Tommy Lee Foy that Ruby did not want to marry him, and he replied that he didn't care anymore, but he was going to register the child anyway in their endeavor to get possession of it. And then Gilchrist adds, I believe the child would be better off with the father than with the mother. So what is the reply that comes up from Brisbane? Well, it is a clear no. Okay. So in many cases where the woman has decided she no longer wishes to marry the applicant, or has become engaged either formally or tribally with another person, then the application does not proceed any further. So, and particularly in the last line, your request therefore to be permitted to marry Ruby cannot be entertained. And that's essentially the tenor of correspondence coming back up from Brisbane from about this time forward. However, there is a slightly interesting coda to this one, because Tommy does indeed register his daughter Clara. So we got the details of Clara's birth. She was born on the 25th of June, 1912 at Escott Station, which is close to Burketown. He gives his name as Tommy Lee Fong, and he's a hawker, age 49, from Canton. Nothing unusual there. Now, when he says he has been married before, it does in fact state that he was married in 1901 in Normanton. Now, I have gone through all the registration numbers for 1901 in Normanton, and I have not found this particular marriage. However, there's one from 1899, which I'm a little bit more suspicious about, which I will endeavour to obtain a certificate of. And then he names the mother as Ruby. She's 25. She's originally from Point Parker. And the person who delivered the child was another Aboriginal lady by the name of Minnie. So we know Clara existed. However, I have not found any further reference to Clara, nor that I found any further reference to Tommy Lee Foy. But this is the difficulty with doing any form of Indigenous and Aboriginal research. Anybody who's endeavoured to do their own family history will know that names are completely fluid. They can be changed. Women can change, they might be Maggie at one place and then they become Polly at a new place because that new employer already has another Maggie. So she's told to pick herself another name, or she becomes Maggie number 2. Okay. And also people may become invisible to the records. So for example, if Tommy Lee Foy decided not to return to China with the view of coming back and does not obtain a certificate of exemption from the dictation test, he may essentially disappear from the records. But this is where we're going to have to leave the story of Tommy and Ruby and Clara. Now, why I have included this small section is just to show you some of the volumes of correspondence which is available for a large number of couples. Primarily, it is Aboriginal women marrying men of South Sea Islander origin, but there are also some Aboriginal women being permitted to marry white men as well, but they also become increasingly rare. And the other reason I wanted to show you this type of, form of documentation as generated by the Act is because it's absent from the case study I'm now going to deliver. Now, for some of you I know in the audience have been following my work since 2016 when I first presented this case study, but it has expanded and I have got new information to present to you this afternoon. So let me introduce you to this couple here. On the left, we have Maggie, formerly Maggie Saville, and on the right, we have Jimmy Gihoy. Now, in 1918, these photos appeared in 2 issues of the Queenslander newspaper, and they were published about 6 months apart. The subjects were unidentified, and the only location given was Augustus Downs Station. However, there was a trail of paperwork that was generated by the Act and other acts that became enforced during this period that led me to conclude that this was in fact Maggie and Jimmy, because they were the only, Jimmy at that time was the only Chinese man on Augustus Downs Station, and Maggie was his wife. Now, we're lucky in Queensland that we have lots of different forms of documentation. This is because the Chinese were also under a great deal of scrutiny by the authorities. So there was a letter that was sent around from the Undersecretary of the Chief Secretary's Office for the Commissioner of Police to every police district in Queensland. They wanted to know exactly how many coloured residents there were in Queensland. And so there was like a census taken. Now, this then became the colour labour census, which has been digitised and it's available to download from the Queensland State Archives. And in some cases, some of the police sergeants didn't clearly read their instructions, and they included entire families onto this census rather than those people who could be considered to be labourers. So we have here Jimmy Gihoy, and you'll notice that the spelling of his name will be very fluid. He's on Punjab Station in 1913. He's 60. I always get a bit suspicious in archival records of any form when the number ends in a 0, because statistically that should be a 1 in 10, but you'll find that a lot of people will have their ages rounded up. And that he arrived in Queensland in 1876, and he's thus not exempted from the Act, and he is a worker, and he's not naturalised. Now, there seemed to have been a little bit of a lack of communication between the police at Burketown, the police at Turnoff Lagoon, and the police at Gregory, because some people are being listed at more than one station. So it might appear that if you did a raw count of the Chinese who were living in the wider lower Western Gulf area in 1913, the answer would be quite a lot higher than the actual number of people, because I've counted at least 15 people who have been recorded more than once at different stations. But this list became very useful as a precursor to the next form of legislation, which was going to be impacting on the lives of the non-British subjects. And that's the Commonwealth War Precautions Alien Regulation of 1916. This regulation was brought in so that for all persons who were not British subjects, they had to register at their nearest police station from October 1916. Now, believe it or not, this regulation also included Europeans who were not British subjects, Americans, very few actually registered, and technically it should have included British women who were legally married to Chinese men, because they inherited their husband's alien status upon their marriage. And if they were widowed, they didn't automatically become British subjects again, and they had to reapply. So I went through looking at all the alien registrations for this part of Queensland. Now, this was a duty that was given to the local police sergeant, who was already the local protector of Aborigines. So a small group of Aboriginal women now found themselves in quite a contradictory position. They were now being classed as aliens in their own land. I collected 88 registrations of Chinese males from Burketown, Gregory Downs, Normanton, Croydon, Turnoff Lagoon, and Cloncurry, where the largest number were, and found that there were 3 Aboriginal women, at least, who were registered with their legal husbands. Now, there may be more because there's some gaps in the number sequence. Now, the upshot of this particular precaution was, once registered, if you moved, you had to give 2 weeks notice to your local police sergeant, and then that you were leaving the district, and also you had to inform the local police in the new place you were arriving that you were in fact arriving. So here we now have a very rich seam of material we can exploit to see the movement of Chinese males and with their Aboriginal wives at this point. Now, Jimmy Gihoy stated he was born in Canton in 1853, and as a 22-year-old, he entered the colonies via the port of Darwin in 1877, as so many did in that western part of the Gulf. Now, here is a case that he has signed his name in Chinese. Okay. Now, it's very important, if possible, to try and find a Chinese signature, because that is the key to finding your family's origins in China. However, because the romanization of the characters is notoriously unreliable and variable. However, I've been informed by a Chinese linguist that the family name is Chu and the given name is Oi. So bears little resemblance to what the name that was being used by Jimmy at the time. So Jimmy, when he registers, he's at Lorraine Station. Then he applies to move to Gregory Down Station. I think, yeah. There he is at Lorraine Station. He applies to move to Augustus Down Station. Sorry, and unfortunately, he doesn't sign in Chinese again. He just gives his mark. But it's because of this move to Augustus Down Station that his wife, Maggie, who Jimmy is legally married to, the local protector determines that Maggie should also be made to register. So now Maggie is battling with two lots of bureaucracy administered by the same person. Yeah. It appears that only the legally married Aboriginal women of Gregory Downs in the Gregory Downs Police District appears to have been registered. Maggie's daughter, Annie Sue Key, is also registered, along with Sarah, the wife of Tommy Chong, all at the same police station. And then we've got one more person who registered, who was Bessie R. Sam, the daughter of Sam R. Coon and Minnie. And she was at the time married to Tommy Ning. However, Aboriginal women who were married to Chinese men in the Normanton Police District did not appear to be required to register. So this just seems to be a little blip in the fact that the way that the regulation was interpreted by one local set of police forced these women to be registered. So Jimmy and Maggie move around the stations, and he is a cook or a gardener, mainly as a gardener, until we get to the point where Jimmy dies in Cloncurry on the 29th of October, 1929. Now, his age was originally registered 50 years, but it was amended to 73 after the register at Cloncurry contacted the registrar at Normanton. From about 2016 on, the Registrar General in Queensland has commenced issuing certificates in the original format instead of the typed written transcript. So the advantage of reobtaining a copy means that you have access to the margin notes. So we can work out from the death certificate that about 1895, 42-year-old Jimmy married 23-year-old Maggie at Normanton. And this is 2 years before the introduction of the Act. The couple had 4 children, but only 2 are named here. More about them later. So then it came a case of trying to find the original marriage. Fortunately, we are now able to, using search by individual number, go through a particular block of registrations until you find a registration that in your local area. So I found this one, spouse name Maggie, married to a Jimmy R. Moy. So I obtained this certificate, and that was a case of jackpot. Okay. Now, Jimmy is marrying under a nickname R. Moy. Okay. So if you're having difficulty in finding any registrations, don't just try and search by the names they adopted, like Jimmy and Maggie, etc., and leave the surname fields blank. You might have a greater deal of success. Okay. And now, once I had the name Amoy to go with, okay, I can see that the information on this certificate is identical to this information that was provided to the registrar in Coloncurry at the time of Jimmy's death. So, looking for the children. Well, they were all registered under the name Amoy, but they weren't registered at any time close to when they were born. This is another interesting thing. In May 1918, Jimmy retrospectively registered all 4 of his children by notifying the registrar of Normanton in writing in Chinese. Unfortunately, that document has not survived. At the same time and place, another Aboriginal Chinese family, that of R. Sam and Louis, registered their children as well. I'm yet to find the catalyst that would have forced these 2 families to retrospectively register all their children at the one place at the one time. What had they heard? What had they been told? Unfortunately, I have not been able to find any correspondence that led to this particular action taking place. So after Jimmy's death, Maggie goes on continuing to work at stations, and then she's at Augustus Downs Station in October 1931 when she's killed in a car accident. Now, if you find any deaths that are subject to a coroner's inquiry, or look for a coroner's inquiry, because you do get a whole wealth of information. Okay. And particularly, you need to be able to search for these by place, because unfortunately with the way that inquests are indexed, it's only the principals, mainly the deceased person, that is indexed. None of the witnesses are, but you should be able to search by place. So by searching for Augustus Downs Station, I managed to find Maggie's inquest. And this tells me that Maggie was in a car that was being driven by an Indian man, Nordar Dean, accompanied by her Aboriginal friends, including another Maggie, and a Violet. They were crossing Augustus Downs Station to view an enormous buffalo which had just been shot, and the car hit a bump and Maggie was thrown out and killed. Okay, so that's what happened with our first generation. So I'm now going to move to the second generation. So we started off with Jimmy and Maggie, and I'm now going to move down to Annie, their oldest child. At the time of Maggie's death, her grown-up children were now scattered. Her son Charlie was in Cherbourg, and the other 3 were believed to be in China. These are the ones which are boxed in red. So in the last decades of the 19th century, the concern was growing in the Australian colonies about the level of coloured immigration to Australia, particularly from China. And so very restrictive immigration legislation was passed, including the introduction of the dictation test. Now, this is covered by many other speakers. Again, I'm not going to go into it much here. All that I just want to add is people who wanted to travel to China and return were subject to having, they were required to apply for an exemption for having the dictation test applied to them on their return. Now, this is Jimmy and Maggie Gihoy's daughter, Annie Gihoy. She was born at Wandoola Station. And when she was a resident at Louis Creek, she legally married 33-year-old station cook Willie Sukey at Lawn Hill in June 1912. Now, for this act, she was supposed to obtain permission from the local protector of Aborigines, as she was, in fact, had Aboriginal blood. But I have not been able to find this correspondence, so maybe they did not apply. And maybe it escaped the attention of the protector at the time because both partners had Chinese surnames. Annie gave her age as 16, which corresponds with her alien registration certificate and her seeded certificate. However, the eagle died amongst you might have noticed when her father Jimmy retrospectively registered her birth in 1918, he gave her date of birth as 1900, making her 12 at the time of her marriage. In either case, she looks so young in this photograph, despite already having had 3 children. So here is her marriage certificate, and Jimmy, her Gihoy, her father, gives permission for the marriage to occur. Yeah. If you can't find the marriage, if you are looking for other siblings of a relationship and you can't find the sibling person you are descended for, do try and find a marriage certificate of another sibling, and because this will give you the parental information you may be missing. But we can see that Willie, he's a bachelor, he's from Macau, he's 43 at the time of the marriage. And let's meet Willie. And this is the 1917 certificate. So Willie and Annie and the children go to China, but Annie's certificate, the return portion appears to be unused. So I'm just making the assumption that she did not return, and I have found no evidence of her return. Also, at the point of Annie's birth registration in 1918, she is apparently already in China. So I'm still wondering the connection there. So Willie Suki had arrived in Darwin in April 1896 and had 3 sons whose births were registered in Queensland. Albert in 1913, Willie Jr. in 1914, and then Tommy in 1917. And 4th son has been alluded to in the records, but he may have been born in China. So because the Commonwealth War Precautions were still in force, at the time Willie is going to go to take his family to China, he is required to fill in one of these change abodes. This time he is going from Lawn Hill Station and he's changing his abode to Thursday Island for the purpose of returning to China. And the date of the voyage and the Tangyuan, the ship, has been filled in. So that's Willie heading outwards. And then here's Willie heading back. And so he's now back in March 1918. And then he returns to working around the stations around Burketown, where he appears to be very much alone. And from the diary at Lawn Hill Station, this is the station diary that tracks the movement of staff in back and forth. He is returned to Lawn Hill Station by January 1923. And from this point on, he's continuously mentioned in the station's diary as illustrated here. Now, station diaries, I could do a complete separate talk about them because they are private personal records. They're not kept in government archival repositories and therefore are notoriously difficult to track down. So Willie then returns back to China. He goes back in 1925 for a year, and then he makes another trip to Hong Kong in 1929 and in 1934, again of several months in duration. And every trip required a certificate exempting him from the dictation test, which is by now being used as a total migration bar. But this is the story gets very complicated, so stick with me, people. So when Annie left for China in 1917, she took with her sons, 4-year-old Albert, 3-year-old Willie, and baby Tommy. All of these births have been formally registered in Burketown. On a return trip from China, Willie attempts to pass off a youth as one of his Chinese-born sons. Okay, this is the 1932 trip. He returns with, in 1929, he returns with his son Albert. In 1932, the immigration authorities caught up with Albert. Someone was aware that Willie's children should have at least had some Aboriginal blood in them. So when a youth of clearly pure Chinese descent was presented, suspicions were raised. However, when you examine Albert's birth certificate, it gives absolutely no indication of any form of Aboriginality. So Albert's Chinese friends in Townsville tried to find Willie to vouch for Albert and say that he's his son, but Willie could not be produced in time. Albert fails the dictation test that is applied to him in Townsville, and because no one has passed the dictation test since 1909, and he's briefly jailed, Albert that is, before being deported on the next ship. Now, you would have thought that Willie would have learned from this experience, but no. In 1935, Willie returns to Sydney this time, not willing to risk Townsville, with another Chinese youth who he attempted to pass off as his son Tommy, for whom he had applied for an extension certificate in 1917 and which Willie had renewed for every 3 years. This included taking on the handprint. So on the left, we have the handprints that were taken. One of Willie as lodged, the one on the left, excuse me, was lodged by Tommy, for Tommy by Willie in 1926. And the other handprint, the one on the right, is the one of the Tommy, which Willie brought with him to Sydney. And as you see, they clearly did not match. So what was Willie doing? Was he being a one-man people smuggling operation? Was he trying to bring in new Chinese people into Queensland? Because at this stage, there was starting to become a severe shortage of people to perform roles as in market gardeners, etc., because there was no top-up Chinese migration due to the various immigration restriction policies at the time. Why didn't he bring his own children back? Didn't they want to come back? Or were they in fact already deceased in China? This perhaps we will never know. Anyway, after this, the phony Tommy was dispatched back to China. Willie is arrested in Murwillumbah. He's working his way back up to Queensland, and he's fined £40 for multiple immigration offences. So Willie did not leave Australia again, and therefore it's probably unlikely that Annie ever saw her husband again. So what happened to Willie? He worked his way around the stations in the Gulf in the 1930s, returning to his trade as a cook. And eventually he died of pneumonia in Townsville in October 1946, age 67. And he's buried in the Chinese cemetery at the Belgian Gardens Cemetery. A month later, the public trustee auctioned off his effects, comprising of a swag and a suitcase of clothes. That's all he had to pay for his burial, which had been done at the expense of the state. As Willie died after World War II, his bones were not exhumed and repatriated to China. Now I can do a complete whole lecture topic just on Chinese funerary, burial and repatriation ceremonies as they occurred in the state of Queensland. So unfortunately, we don't know what happened to Annie and her 3 sons, but we do know that she was in correspondence with her brother, Charlie Gihoy, who was at Cherbourg as late as 1938, when he is interviewed by Norman Tyndale. Now, a closer examination of the Tyndale genealogy family history cards from the late 30s brought up this little surprise here. Circle, you see the card for Lizzie Jackson, who was interviewed on Palm Island. Her mother is named as Linda of the Wani tribe, and her father is named as Willie Suki, the Chinese cook at Lawn Hill Station. Now, having a look at the Lawn Hill Station's diary for this time, it really appears that this is our same Willie. So he has another family. And descendants of this family now live in Charters Towers. So I did a bit of a shuffle through of the alien registration, of the personal data cards. And from my calculations, about 8% of all the people interviewed by Norman Tyndale had some degree of Chinese ancestry. And these are people who are only being interviewed on the eastern coast of Queensland. This is the late 1930s. This does not include the people who were interviewed by Tyndale in the 1960s at places like Doomadgee, Mornington Island, etc. So I dare say the proportion would be much higher. But from the sample I had, it's roughly about 8% has got some degree of Chinese heritage. Now I'm coming very close to the end. So I just want to include one more thing, which I just found very recently. And this is this marriage here. Again from Normanton, for a Charlie R. Singh, who's a cook, and he is at Coolalla Station on Cloncurry Road, 36, when he marries Helen R. Sam. Now, there's nothing really special about this marriage. I have, in this case, obtained what is called the marriage source documents. And these are available from the Queensland Registry of Birth, Deaths and Marriages. They cost exactly the same amount as a marriage certificate, but you get all the paperwork that was filled in by the parties at the time of their marriage, and they have not been transcribed. So we have here a signature, which is really wonderful, both of the groom and the witness. And then on the next page, we have 2 more pieces of information which are not found on the standard marriage registration. Here, Charlie is giving his permission for Helen to marry because she's under the age of 21. And here, the consent of Percy Gilbraith, the protector of Aborigines, was given to the marriage of Helen R. Sam and Charlie R. Singh. The said Helen being of mixed race. So this is another indication that we have the involvement of the protector. Now, this was the fantastic piece of information I was able to obtain, because there had been an assumption that this Charlie R. Singh was the same Charlie R. Singh who applied for a market garden in Cloncurry in 1906. But because the signatures are different, the characters are quite different, I can now identify that this is not the same man. And I always suspected there were at least 2, possibly 3 Charlie R. Singhs in the Gulf simultaneously, but this is conclusive proof that to have a signature is the as best as you're going to get. Now, I've been busily collecting signatures of Chinese people from the Gulf. I haven't worked out a way that I can easily share them with the world yet, and I will need the help of a linguist or two to help me transcribe them. But this will be a valuable resource for people who are indeed trying to track their ancestry that one step back to China. So I just want to finish by saying, okay, these are the places where I found all the records. So the Queensland State Archives will become your best friend if you're doing this form of research. There is a wealth of material, particularly if it's more than 100 years old. It's open in the public domain. Some of it has already been digitized. For example, the marriage correspondence files, 1911, 1914 are online for anybody to read. Market garden licenses have also been indexed. So there is a lot of material available. Birthdays and marriages in Queensland, this is what you have available. If you pay your money, you virtually have, you can get your certificate instantly as a download, which is quite addictive and expensive fun, I have found in the preparation of this presentation. And of course, for those people looking at the CEDATs, the certificates of exemption from the dictation test, and of course the alien registration for World Wars I and II, these were Commonwealth functions. So they're found in the Brisbane office of the Commonwealth Archives. And of course there is the couple of very good learning aids which are available as well. And of course, if you want to find out more about CEDATs and other information, there's a lot of research that has been done of late. And also for those people who are looking for that second step back to China, and read anything by Dr. Kate Bagnall on the subject. And of course, as I mentioned at the start, I really need to owe a great debt of thanks to Regina Gantner with her professor with her book Mixed Relations. This book is starting to become a little bit difficult to obtain now, but there are copies around. It has wonderful stories, interviews and photographs of many of the families I've mentioned today, and of course Sandy Robb's thesis. So that brings me up to exactly 4 o'clock, okay? And I'll just give myself a shameless plug. I have been for the last 5 years collating the Queensland Chinese Death Index, where I have been going through looking at arranging Chinese registered deaths by place rather than name, because what I'm finding with many family history researchers, they know where their family were, but because of the way that the names have been so messed up by administrators everywhere for decades, identifying a particular death may easily be done geographically. So if anybody out there has got any death certificates from Queensland, please contact me. So I am happy to take questions. I'm sure there might be some in the chat, so I'll stop sharing now.
Thank you so much, Hilda. It's really interesting. I mean, your research is just so thorough, you know, from the beginning to the very end. It really listened to it like a detective story. So I can imagine like you so enjoy, you know, finding all the clues and in unexpected places. It's really fascinating. Yes, if audiences have questions, so please place it on Q&A. But while you are thinking, I have a couple of questions, Hilda. The first question is, I can see that you trace the case studies up to a second generation to a point. Is there any case study you traced up to present?
Yes, I have traced a number up to the present day. I don't mention them because of various privacy concerns. And also some people are not actually aware of either of their Chinese or Indigenous heritage at this stage, or they only find out because someone gave them an ancestry DNA test for Christmas.
Wow, that's really, really interesting.
So yes, I have traced quite a few families up to the present day, and I am assisting some people at the moment. And if you are one of those people who I promised to assist about 3 or 4 months ago, Christmas's holidays are coming, I will get to you. We got locked out of the archives for a wee while there, but not as long as you guys have been locked out of the archives.
Yeah, but also I think with the time goes on, so there will be more people who will be interested in finding out where they were because of the discriminatory status that being lifted as well. So I think that's also part of a role that I would play for the archive interest in people interested in their past.
Yeah,
I have another question.
I just want to add, if it wasn't for the legislation, there wouldn't be the need to create generate the paperwork. And so where quite a lot of Chinese men have just disappeared from the record are those who never applied for a CEDAT to return home. Many Chinese men did just return home with the intention of never coming back. And so they didn't apply for a CEDAT. And so their outward voyages aren't captured.
But the other bit, when they went back, did they usually bring children with them, or they left the children in Australia?
No, we've got 2 cases from the area where children have been brought back, and then we're still working on a couple of families where we can't trace the children whether they came back or not. So we assume that they are still over there, or their descendants are now.
I have another question before I go to the audience's question is, when the second generation meaning Aboriginal blood and Chinese blood as women, was it easier to marry those women for Chinese men?
Yes, it became easier as the generations went on, and it also really depended on it was variable. Some police districts, they honestly didn't really care, and long as both partners had Chinese names, they didn't fill in the paperwork. A couple of places, either clergy or police had been admonished by the protector of Aborigines for not doing the paperwork before allowing a wedding to happen. Or there are other areas where every marriage where there was the slightest possibility of Aboriginal blood, that marriage was reported to at least the local protector.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I have more questions about. I'll go to the audiences first. One particular question about the video. Yes, this session has been recorded. We always record the session and then we'll make it available in roughly about 2 weeks. So in 2 weeks, you will receive our newsletter, which will have the link to this recorded session. Yes, you will see this recording and all the previous sessions as well. So the first question from John. John said, could you please post the Rob thesis details again? I suppose you.
Well, that's on the link for the final slide.
Yeah.
I could try and pop it into the chat. Let's see if I can do this. How well I can multitask.
That'll be tricky. I think.
Yeah, I've got the link now. Can I pop it into the chat? Okay, I've literally just popped the link into the chat, and it only goes to the hosts and the panelists. So you need
we can forward it. Yeah.
Yes, please forward that.
Sure. Yeah. Yanni or Cherie will do that. Okay. Second question from Cam. Thank you for excellent presentation. I have a very simple question showing I know nothing about the topic. Did any descendants of Chinese Aboriginal heritage marry Aboriginal men? In fact, did any non-Aborigines marry Aboriginal men?
Yes and yes is the simple answer. Yeah. And particularly after once we get into the 1960s and 1970s, particularly in the northwest Queensland, we've got many incidences of Aboriginal men and men of Chinese-Aboriginal heritage marrying Aboriginal women and Aboriginal women of Chinese-Aboriginal heritage, as well as all of the above marrying into the white community.
Yeah. Christy Love, she sent you a message. She said, thank you so much, Hilda, such a great talk. I don't have any certificates, but would like to connect with you about indexing of names in characters. So, yeah.
Okay. Yes.
And next question from Anna. As a sociologist of religion, I'm interested in your research. If your research is investigating religious or spiritual dimensions of any of these marriages and relationships.
Well, most of the marriages actually occurred in the Western Gulf area, either in the registry office or the courthouse, or was conducted by a justice of the peace, because ministers of religion were few and far between at the best of times. So I don't think anything can really be read into the fact that most people just had a legal form wedding. And then going on to what I find, if you look, for example, in school admission registers, say, for example, Cloncurry, now that they're available online from the Queensland State Archives, that you can see that the next generation along, these are children who are starting school in the 1920s and 30s. Cloncurry is a bigger town, and it has a choice of churches, and you'll find that some of the children, when you register your children at school, you actually have to register them with a religious persuasion. And so seems to be 50-50 EC, which stands for the Church of England, the English Church, or P. In this case, it's not pagan, it's Protestant, and with one Catholic family. So it's really a case of who was available to perform what role at the time. Yeah. So you can imagine how overworked the local police sergeants were, besides registering aliens, protecting Aboriginal people, being the inspector of stock and slaughterhouses, in issuing liquor licenses, bagatelle, billiard and timber cutting licenses. Their day was full.
Yes, it's really interesting. So many dimensions. I mean, you can talk about just through and because of your researches. Next, a question from Michael. Michael says, great talk, Hilda, thanks. I'm interested in districts and the villages of origin in China, tricky like your names and signatures. Have you come across many headstones and being able to collate that with your archival resources at all?
Okay, very few. I have not found any legible headstones in the area which I was investigating, which was around the Burke town. There were headstones have been found in Croydon Cemetery and in Croydon. Oh gosh, Normanton, I think there are some. This is where you'll find your local family history and genealogical society very useful, because there was a series done in Queensland many years ago, a grave looker history, and with many small cemeteries. And also now a lot of this has moved online to, say, the Australian Cemetery Index. Some people are contributing photos to find the grave, etc. So yeah, so a lot of the cases, the headstones are being photographed, but are not haven't yet been transcribed. So it's simply a case, if you're interested in a particular cemetery, search by the cemetery name and just browse through all the images.
Another question from Simon. Any particular periods when such intermarriages peaked, so to speak, or when the number waned?
Yeah, well, the number definitely peaked in 1898, just after the Act was enforced. I think this was a case of rounding up everybody known to the inspectors. Definitely waned by the time you get, there's a bit of a lull towards the end of World War I, and then you start to pick up again in the early 1920s, because by this stage you now have the children or the couples who were married prior to the Act now being old enough to be married themselves.
Right. I think it's also from Simon. Then the following on question is, do you know what the current percentage of Aboriginal people with the Chinese heritage in North Queensland?
Well, northwest Queensland, so I'm dealing in that lower Gulf to the Queensland border. No, I haven't calculated it yet. I'm still working on it. Significant is what I would say.
Anonymous question. Why was it so important to document non-European marriages? Would say a marriage between a French person and a British subject be under the same scrutiny?
No, it wasn't under the same scrutiny, because it was it was the point of being protecting the 1897 Act to protect Aboriginal people. There was a degree of eugenics involved here, that by the time we get into the 1890s, a number of people were concerned that the number of Aboriginal people were being decimated for various reasons, and also they were being exploited by unscrupulous employers, etc. So the idea was basically to sort of separate Aboriginal people from the wider society for their own protection.
Cam, just seeking clarification about your answer to her previous question, yes and yes. She said on elaboration, you mentioned the 50s and the 60s and the marriage between mixed people. Does the yes and yes refer to non-Aboriginals towards the end of last century and first decade of the 20th century? Also
okay, so I might have not heard that fully, but by the time you get into the 1960s, and when the acts were finally lifted, people were free to marry whoever, and therefore the paper trail ends. Okay, what you did was your own business, and you did not have to involve a large bureaucracy. And what was the first part? Sorry,
yes, just so a marriage between mixed people. Does the yes and yes refer to Aboriginal towards the end of the last century and the first decades of the 20th century, also married Aboriginal men?
Okay, right. Okay. Well, there were, if it was asking, were there any Chinese women, of Chinese women who married Aboriginal men? As there were so few Chinese women in North Queensland, most of their fates have been determined. So we do have some Chinese women who are only 1/4 Aboriginal, and they are sort of tending to marry more into the Chinese community. Those with, and then we haven't even touched on there are also a group of women who were Chinese fathers and European mothers. There was a huge number of them in the Gulf of Carpentaria. Read Sandy's thesis. Then they started to marry either into the Chinese community or the Chinese Aboriginal community. That question might be better answered in a table.
That's right. I think the last questions is again from an anonymous. At what point does protection become a denial of a freedom to marry?
It was really becoming a denial of freedom to marry progressively from, well, in the Gulf, it seemed to last a bit longer. The couples were being approved, but by 1919, there were some very short, sharp replies from Brisbane saying that how dare you even entertain the thought of even applying for this marriage to occur.
I think to be fair to Cam, last bit, I mean Aboriginal men marrying non-Aboriginals.
Okay, Aboriginal men marrying non-Aboriginals. Yes, It was very rare. They also had to, in that case, I know of at least 2 white women who had to apply to the protector of Aborigines to marry Aboriginal men, neither of them in the Gulf. One of the best known case I know of was in central Queensland. Yes, so it's much rarer, but there were some couple of European women who their correspondence survives about, and where the protector was the local protector was quite flummoxed, because with a close reading of the legislation didn't make provision for the fact that European women would want to do this. They should have known that because of the number of European women who are marrying Chinese men, why would that not naturally follow?
I'm sure there are so many questions. I have a last one bit. I noticed that on your, many evidence shows that Chinese men, most of them all are cooks, and one garden. Yeah. Any other occupations?
Okay, there were a few occupations. If they were on the stations, they were mainly cooks and gardeners. If they were in any of the smaller towns, we've got one Sam who was a tailor, and that's how I can distinguish him from Sam the gardener. For those people who were closer to the coast, say at Corumba, there was a couple who were fishermen. In the Cloncurry side, there were more storekeepers, and particularly into 20s and the 30s, and we have storekeepers and bakers. So the occupations they followed really depended on where they were and at what point they were in the gold rush cycle as well.
I see. Not just all cooks, marry Aboriginal women.
Yeah, many of them started life as being gold miners.
Yeah,
they came for the gold and then they stayed on as cooks.
Thank you so much, Hilda. I'm sure we have loads of more questions. You will have to come back next year.
Happy to.
Yeah, so like you have many aspects that you can go more into detail, which is really fascinating. I think it's because your research is in the archive, so those things bring out today, it's just people didn't even think of. So as I mentioned, today's lecture is the last one in 2021 series. In 2022, we will continue our online Chinese-Australian history series. So we have already lined up a few very interesting topics and speakers. And Hilda, you have to come back again. Okay, and anyone else, if you would like to contribute to 2022 series, please email me. I've just posted my email address in the chat. So any proposals you have, more than welcome. And also, apart from the public lectures, our institute also do a lot of art-related events and promote creative arts. So with the Christmas and New Year break coming soon, well, many of us still want to be able to fly overseas. You may think of taking a road trip to the beautiful, stunning countryside. So sort of related to today's topic is iconic Australian Indigenous artist Tracy Moffat. She's featured in our next art exhibition. She has just completed a new artwork called A Haunting. So I sent the link to you as well. It's a abandoned farmhouse, and she lit up. It looks like a haunted house. It's beautiful because you have to watch it from a remote a bit of a place, and it's outside the double. So you make a road trip and while you see the artwork. So yeah, that'll be really interesting. Thank you again, Hilda, and thank you everyone of this very interesting series this year, and many of you stayed with us throughout the year. So we really thank you, and we hope 2022 will be a better year than 2021. And stay safe and keep well. We see you then. Thank you. Thank you, Hilda. Thank you, everyone.